Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Erich Kurschat. I'm the owner of Harmony Insights LLC, which is an organization that lets me work with companies and consultants on leveraging the DISC personality assessment with their employees and their clients. It's something that a lot of people are doing virtually right now as they look to engage and develop their remote teams. I'm also the founder of HR Hot Seat, an inclusive mastermind community of HR professionals that started out with the goal of bringing 8 to 10 people together, and now, almost 4 years later, has over 2,500 members in 10 different licensed chapters around the country. So if you are an HR professional or you serve HR professionals, you can find out more about HR Hot Seat at hrhotseat.com. You've joined us today for a Harmony Insights lunch date, as I've come to call them. This one is entitled Enforcing Rules and Standards with Empathy, with my featured guest today, Gary Savine. A few weeks ago, decided that there was just a lot going on, and I wanted to remain inspired by people who inspire me. And so I thought, well, I'm going to take 30 minutes out of my lunch hour, Central Time. I know it's not lunch hour for all of you on this call, but 30 minutes out of my lunch hour to talk with people who really inspire me in different ways. When I leave conversations with these people, I feel better about myself, who I am. I feel better about the world. And I think it's a good pick me up as I go into my afternoon. So these are a bit selfish, but hopefully those of you who have joined are looking to get something out of today's conversation with Gary Savine. Gary, welcome to the conversation.
Hey, thanks, Eric. It's good to be here. Good to see you.
I had so much what's the word, confidence in you that I simply reached out to you and said, I just want to talk to you. You decide what we're going to discuss. And you responded, sounds like fun. I'd love to talk about how organizations are or are not upholding their standards and rules and guidelines with empathy. And I thought, fantastic conversation. So I'm so excited to spend a half an hour chatting about that with you today.
That's excellent. I am too.
Before we get started, I would love for you to just give a quick introduction, I guess, by way of getting started. A quick introduction, let people know not only who you are and what you do, but the context that you bring to this conversation, such that you are the best person I could be talking to about this, as opposed to anybody else I could have invited.
Oh, I like the way you phrased that. Sure. Well, I'm Gary Savine. I am the owner and founder of Savine Employment Law. It's a boutique employment law firm in Chicago that I started in 2012. At a basic level, I think this plays into our topic, we help employers make tough HR decisions, and we serve as their advocates and counselors when their decisions are challenged. Our practice is focused on employment litigation, labor and employment counseling, compliance, training, and workplace investigations. And prior to opening my firm, I also served as Chief Employment Counsel for Navistar International Corporation and for Hillrom Holdings, both also in Chicago, and I sat on Hillrom's HR leadership team. So that's my background. I work arm in arm with HR professionals, and we talk about enforcement issues and making humane enforcement decisions day in and day out.
I love it. And I know you to be an active member of the HR Hot Seat Chicago community as well. And I appreciate that, of course. I've promised people a meaningful, actionable conversation today. And I'd like to start off, it'll be meaningful throughout, but we are all impacted in some way by the coronavirus right now. A lot of us are working from home who don't usually. Some of us may know people who have had the virus themselves and have had to deal with that. Hopefully all of us know to some extent the essential workers who are out there fighting on the front lines on our behalf. How have you been impacted personally by coronavirus, if you're willing to share?
Sure. Well, fortunately, no one in my immediate circle has contracted the virus yet, as far as I know.
Mhm.
We're all just doing our best to stay safe and keep each other safe and give each other support and advice along the way. And I think the biggest challenge for me has been enduring the physical distance from my parents and my siblings back in Detroit. I'm in Chicago and they're in Detroit. With each year, it gets harder to get home on a regular basis, and I miss them. Technology is great, and thank goodness for Zoom. A pandemic couldn't have come at a better time, technology-wise, but nothing replaces a hug. And best I can do now is offer support and advice as we all navigate these crazy dangers. excuse me, I'm doing my best and I'm counting the days until I can hop on I-94 and visit them.
Yes, and I have family. I grew up in the Detroit area as well, as you and I have discussed, and so I'm very familiar with that I-94 trip. I just read an article recently about Zoom burnout and made a number of really interesting points. But it's also been great just to see how people have been able to remain connected in ways like this. But then also, as we've celebrated various holidays over the past several weeks, people being able to get together in that way when they can't get together face to face, and so the connection piece of it, I think, is still very inspiring at a time when we could honestly be so disconnected from one another if it weren't for platforms like this.
We certainly are fortunate, and I have to give a shout out to you and the way that you have embraced Zoom in the HR hot seat community, the way that you bring us all together in group meetings, and then you break us out into discussion groups. I've actually shared that model with other groups in which I participate regularly in Zoom calls, and we are finding that by following practices that you've adopted and you've cultivated, we're making more meaningful connections over Zoom. A platform, as you mentioned, can be fatigue inducing if it's not used properly.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that, and I've learned those tips from others, so we're just passing them along, much like my wife is passing along sourdough starter right now for people who are baking bread. And I promise we're going to get to the meat of our conversation today. But I've just loved that we have all these people involved with a similar project, that of baking bread, and the way that they do it is by sharing the starter with one another in a socially distant, um, conscious way. But
That's
anyway,
fantastic.
so many tips and practices to be shared with one another. So let's get into the meat of our conversation today. We're talking about enforcing rules and standards with empathy. Quite often, things that you may not fully expect to go together. I think the way I see it, rules, guidelines, standards, etc., are kind of over here on one side, and then you have empathy and compassion and some of these more emotional terms over here on this side. And you're suggesting that it's possible that we marry those things. Give me a sense of where this is coming from and why this is a topic that speaks so well to you.
Sure. Yeah. It's. I hope that it's possible. It's certainly something that I believe that we all need to try because these times are so trying for all of us, whether we're the enforcer of the rule or the person responsible for complying with the rule. My clients, my employer side clients, they've come to me and, traditionally they would, outside of this pandemic that we're facing, they come to me with enforcement issues every day and ask, do we have enough facts to support terminating this person, and they focus mostly on an evidence-based analysis. Do we have the facts to support a decision? Are we treating people consistently? And often that's where the conversation ends. And I'm pleased that most of my clients, we share an appreciation for the human side of the decisions that we're talking about. And we work in a discussion of the humanity of the decision. And the employee relations impact too. We're talking about human relationships that are impacted when someone is disciplined or fired. So oftentimes empathy comes into the discussion, but it's not expressly labeled as empathy. It's
Right.
just, how is this going to, it's more along the lines of a loose set of questions. How is this going to impact the person? What do you think is affecting them in their lives that might be limiting them and preventing them from complying with the rule? Let's not just jump to the conclusion that they are bad actors.
Right.
But more recently, in group discussions that I've been in, I'm hearing a lot of people say, we are just ripping up policies because we can't enforce them and we're not going to expect people to follow them. And it's given rise to spirited debates over whether that's right and will it lead to anarchy within the workplace, and where's the happy medium. And every time I hear this conversation arise in my networking groups and whatnot, empathy in some form always comes up. An
Hmm.
appreciation for the differences in the stressors that we're facing and the personal circumstances that are preventing us from meeting the responsibilities that we normally can meet day in and day out without problem. That's kind of the context in which it's arisen.
I'm wondering if you have found, or you would agree, that in times of crisis like this, that our natural inclination maybe is not to go so quickly to empathy. That as we lose control, that there are at least certain personality styles will say that respond by saying, "This is chaos. I feel like I have no control. The only way for me to regain some level of control is to identify and enforce these rules and guidelines and standards that have kept us afloat for so long." Right?
Mhm.
They've gotten us this far, so they must be able to get us through what we're dealing with now. And that is a very sort of black and white um, way to attempt to, again, regain some semblance of control in times of crisis. Empathy, as great as it sounds, my guess is not anywhere near the forefront of that conversation, at least in the beginning. Would you agree that empathy ends up being kind of a step two, where um, people have to get through initial stages of grief and loss and some of these other things that we've been feeling
Mhm.
before we're in a place to really understand what other people are going through and how we can be more compassionate?
I think where empathy lands in my conversations with my clients correlates with the size of the organization, its ownership structure, and whether it's a unionized or non-unionized environment. And
Mhm.
those are all factors that play into the willingness and the willingness of the decision maker to factor empathy into the decision, and it runs the gamut. So I find that smaller businesses where the owners and the decision makers have a more close knit relationship with their workforce, empathy is usually right up there in the
Mm.
priority pecking order of factors that go into a decision. But the larger the organization and the more dispersed leadership is, and um, the less connected, personally connected the decision makers are to the employees affected by the decision, um, the more likely it is that empathy will be sort of a secondary concern. And then in a unionized environment, which by its nature must be more rules based in order to comply with collective bargaining agreements and to make the decisions more easily defensible in the grievance process, empathy often is very hard to factor in as effectively or as easily. But it does still play a role, even in a unionized environment, because even if a decision ends up going to the level of review of an arbitrator is going to look at a decision, an enforcement decision, for its fairness. And fairness and empathy usually go hand in hand. So there is a role for empathy in enforcement decisions, regardless of what kind of organization you're dealing with. But you have to be, as the counselor, the advisor, you have to be sensitive to the nature of the organization and how it values empathy.
It strikes me suddenly that we've been using this word quite a bit without defining it, and I'm often hesitant to define words because I feel like there are certain words that defy clear definition. Communication is one of those, and I deal a lot in communication myself with the work that I do around DISC. And change, I think, is another one. I think these are things that we've all experienced, but when we're asked to put them into words, they become kind of tricky to do so. What does empathy mean to you in the work that you do with your clients?
I'm glad you asked that question because Eric, in preparing for this talk, I was I went right to the dictionary. That's where I started.
Great place to start.
Merriam-Webster.com and looked at the definition to see if it resonated with the way that I approach the topic. Um, and the simple definition, I think, fits well. It's the ability to put yourself in the place of another person and understand their feelings by identifying with them. It's recognizing, and then beyond that, I think you can say it's recognizing that it's a choice that we make to extend ourselves to others. It's potentially limited by your own life experience. You know, you've got to
Mhm.
check to be truly empathic. You have to check your cultural literacy and your emotional savvy. You need to make sure that you understand differences and can communicate differences. Recognizing how your own biases and how they affect your attitude about non-compliance in others, and also recognizing that our support roles as HR professionals, if you will, requires both empathy and advocacy. And those two things go hand in hand.
You've come so prepared. I really appreciate that.
Just off the top of my head.
I remember earlier on, though, now I don't know that I could probably put them into words myself, being really struck by the differences, the subtle difference between sympathy and empathy. And we won't go into that now, but for those who are curious, I would recommend looking up the definitions of each of those words because they are subtle differences, but they're meaningful differences. I think empathy, is it on Google? I think you can look on Google, maybe the Google dictionary, and type in any word, and it shows you over time its usage. And from early on to now, and then empathy, I think, is one of those words that I've looked at recently, where it's just spiked over the last several decades, the last couple in particular. And I'm always curious why that is. Why suddenly there's this culture around certain words, and I think empathy is one of those that just really resonates with people that we're hearing and using more and more often these days than we have in the past.
I think you raised a good point that shouldn't be that we should touch on for a moment. Empathy and sympathy are often confused. Sympathy is sharing the feelings that another person is experiencing. It's making it a shared experience. Where empathy is consciously putting yourself in another person's shoes and appreciating that they're feeling something and experiencing something differently than you are.
Look at you. That's great. That's perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for. Yeah, that's and I think you mentioned the word differences and biases. These things that can really get in the way of me being able to put on your shoes for for a little bit, to walk around. And even as somebody who facilitates conversations around differences in communication and personality style, my wife will be the first to admit that, she'll come home and she'll tell me about a challenge she's had at work, and I'm sitting here like shaking my head thinking, well, that's not that. I can't imagine that would be too much of a challenge. Right. And then I have to stop. I have to intentionally stop myself and say, now, wait a minute, how is she coming at this? And what are the biases that are getting in the way of me being able to understand that this could be a challenge for her, and vice versa? What are the things that are getting in the way of her understanding some of the things that I might be challenged by that might come so easily to her, right? So I think there's this that in itself is a difficult enough conversation. What do you think are some of the additional challenges, especially now that people are facing taking this conversation around empathy, which we all agree is so vitally important, and applying it to the rules and guidelines and standards of what can be a black and white workplace on occasion?
Yeah, yeah. There are I think three major obstacles to factoring empathy properly into decision making. One is the fear of compliance repercussions. And let me say up front, I hate to have to say it in my presentations, but I'm not providing legal advice here. Uh, every situation is unique, as everyone knows, and many employment decisions have legal ramifications that necessitate factoring empathy in differently. What we're talking about are universal rules for expressing and honoring human dignity. But there is at a core, often in organizations, a fear of the repercussions of factoring empathy into compliance. Will empathy mean making exceptions? And if so, will the exceptions devour the rule? And like I said before, lead to anarchy, or will it create legal risk? So that's one obstacle. It's having to sort of talk through with leadership what the compliance repercussions are, and can we coalesce around the right balance in factoring empathy in, that's consistent with our risk tolerance. Another is lacking a simple understanding of what empathy is and how it can be cultivated. It's kind of an esoteric topic. A lot of people believe that empathy is an inborn trait, but it's a skill. It can be practiced, and it's an important leadership trait. And along those lines, a related obstacle would be a lack of alignment between leaders on whether empathy should play a role at all, and whether leaders can consistently apply empathy in the right way.
I've experienced certain leaders that would view empathy almost as a weakness, as a vulnerability that they struggle with, and I think we would agree, and anyone else on this conversation would agree, that a trademark or hallmark of a strong leader is somebody who really understands the value of being empathetic and vulnerable, hand in hand. If you associate the two,
Yeah.
but it's more of a sign of strength rather than weakness for sure.
Yeah, I think that's well put. And I think that it's, um, for empathy to be embraced as a value by an organization takes more than human resources expressing its importance and its value. The value of it has to be embraced at the very top of the shadow of a leader concept, of your executive team espousing its role in the organization.
Yeah, great. So just to do a time check, we have 8 minutes left. And in case I didn't say this off the top, at about 12:30, I would love to be able to encourage folks to unmute themselves and contribute and ask questions at that point of us. So we'll do that if people want to stick around at 12:30. In the meantime, you're welcome to include questions in the chat. I'd be interested how you, those of you participating on this call, how you define empathy or examples that you have seen in your own workplaces as you and your organizations have struggled to uphold standards and rules. Actually, along those lines, I put together a quick poll. If you want to contribute to that or participate in this poll, it's anonymous. If you can see it, it says, "Does empathy play a role in your organization's enforcement decisions?" And your options are yes, on occasion, and what's empathy? So you can fill that out as we continue our conversation here. So Gary, you've laid out pretty clearly what some of the challenges are that people are facing. If we can transition then in the time that we have left to, once people identify those challenges and they come to terms with them and they admit openly to them, what are some steps that folks can take to experience immediate progress in the area of applying what we've been discussing related to empathy to the rules, guidelines, standards, et cetera, that they would like to uphold within their organizations?
Great, that's a great question. And I'll try to lay out like a simple three-step plan, if you will. And maybe this will serve as a good springboard for the discussion when we open the microphones up. Like you and I talked before, first, the first order of business is to help your organization, help your leaders coalesce around a definition of empathy, recognizing that it's a choice, and it's a choice that we make to extend ourselves, and it's a skill that we cultivate, and it's a value that we want in our leaders. Two is decide together with your leadership team what role empathy should play in rules enforcement. You really need buy-in and consensus. You need to, on that front, there may need to be a conversation that brings the leadership to a recognition that your traditional system of rules and divisions don't work in this environment. And you may need to talk about the risks and benefits that I alluded to earlier in that trade-off, so everyone accepts it, and you reduce blame games later when empathic decision-making results in consequences that might be difficult. The goal is to gain compliance humanely.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third action would be to find ways to help your leaders practice cultivating empathy. And what that looks like may be a great topic of conversation for all of us, what we do to cultivate empathy in ourselves and in others. But some simple things to think about might be encouraging a shift to an accommodation mindset rather than the mindset of we're just here to bring down the hammer.
Mm-hmm.
Communicating relatably by making sure that you take the time to relate to a person's circumstances before you speak, and anticipating their personal needs and acknowledging to them your goals of meeting them in advance of bringing down that hammer, as I like to say.
Yeah.
But even just, and maybe at a most basic level, we can cultivate empathy most basically by practicing courtesy and respect, being dependable. Don't let your colleagues down, because your credibility is on the line in the way that you make decisions if you can't reflect a respect for the rules yourself.
I love that, leading by example. It's so easy to expect others to comply, but when you're not yourself, and I feel like so much of what you've recommended goes back to definition and alignment. So what are we talking about to begin with? How does this apply within our organization? And is it something that we not can just all abide by, because that almost sounds like coercion at that point.
Yeah.
But is it something we all believe? Can we rally around this and say, yes, this is a central value of our organization? Why wouldn't it be a part of our rule making?
And I would say, and I trust you, Eric, of all people, to appreciate this. What I appreciate about most of my clients is that they have each defined a values statement for their companies or organizations. And in those values statements, there is always language that I can anchor this conversation around, that I can relate the topic of empathy to something in that value statement that describes how they want people to be treated and how they want people to treat others.
Right. That's great. And if that's missing from their value statement to begin with, they may have an entirely different
That's
uh,
right.
conversation to have,
You
right?
know what kind of battle you're going to be having on this topic if there is no if there is no value. Because what that tells you is that the organization that the leaders already appreciate the fragility of human interaction and the need for respect and dignity and valuing others. And they're already practiced in having that kind of conversation. So there's probably already some sort of a system in place that you can plug into for having this dialogue.
I think the fragility of human interaction needs to be the title of an upcoming Harmony Insights lunch date. You may have to come back for that. I'm going to share the results briefly from our poll. We had 50% of the respondents say yes, that their organization does enforce decisions with empathy, and then the other half says on occasion. We had nobody that responded, "What's empathy?" So either they were all good or they just decided not to participate. So thank you for that. Um, if you can believe it, we are already on our time here. Just about, we
Wow.
only a couple of minutes left. So there are two important questions that I want to ask of you before we wrap up, and then invite people to participate if they'd like to unmute themselves. Number one, um, are there any resources out there that you would recommend to people who want to explore this topic a little bit further?
Sure. I actually have a short list of links to articles that I um, came across when I was thinking through this topic, and I would love to share it with your audience.
Yeah.
These are all free resources online, and the articles look at empathy and rules enforcement from a variety of perspectives, not just from the perspective of HR applying um, an HR rules handbook, but
Yeah.
empathy from the standpoint of law enforcement and empathy in handling the homeless population. And it was fascinating, though, what I found online when I looked at how empathy should apply when enforcing rules. I'm happy to share those resources.
Great. I appreciate that. And you will get those to me, and then I will send out an email to everybody, blind copy everybody who is on this conversation through what you submitted with your registration. And I will make sure that you get a single follow-up email from me with those resources. So thanks for that, Gary. And then lastly, for people who do want to connect with you after this to get some guidance, pick your brain on various things, or just talk through some of this a little bit further, how can people find you?
Oh, I appreciate the question. You can find our law firm at www.savinelaw.com. It's SAVINELAW.com. You can also email me at gnoah, like Noah's Ark, gnoah at savinelaw.com.
Excellent. Thank you for that. This has been a wonderful conversation. I am so appreciative of you agreeing to chat with me today.
Oh, this is fun.
Again, I can be found at harmonyinsights.com. If you've enjoyed this conversation and would want to attend additional Harmony Insights lunch dates or just help me spread the word, you can do that using the URL harmonyinsights.com/lunch dates. I've just added a couple of great conversations to the calendar for the upcoming weeks. I won't go into it now, but some really interesting conversations, including around Stoic philosophy, which I did not expect to add, but there it is. Um, and HR Hot Seat, if you want to learn more about the HR Hot Seat inclusive mastermind community there, harmonyinsights.com for everything related to DISC. Gary, thank you again for joining us.